Right, so just the other day, Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz delivered one of the most chilling public statements to emerge from Israel's assaults on Gaza and Yemen. Standing before reporters after a wave of airstrikes on the Yemeni capital of Sanaa, Katz threatened his adversaries with a plague of the firstborn. The phrase drawn, of course, from the biblical book of Exodus, where the firstborn of Egypt was slaughtered in a divine act of retribution when Pharaoh refused to set the Israelites free. It's a reference heavy with the weight of extermination, and coming from the modern day state of Israel, hiding behind a divine right to excuse their war crimes, and therefore it is one that resonates far beyond military jargon. By invoking it, Katz moved beyond the standard language of precision strikes and military targets, and instead invoked mass death, explicitly including children. For decades, Israel has maintained that it does not deliberately target civilians, especially children, even as independent investigators and humanitarian organizations have documented the repeated destruction of hospitals, schools, and residential areas in Gaza, where almost half the population are, of course, children. Katz's words represent a stark departure from that long-standing line. They suggested that collective punishment, war crime as that is, was now being openly embraced as state doctrine, that Israel was no longer even hiding the fact, not that they could with any credibility anymore anyway. His rhetoric exposed the underlying reality. Israel's war, both in Gaza and now being exported more overtly to Yemen, has obliterated any distinction between combatants and civilians. Right, so when it comes to the political nastiness of Israeli politics, Israel Katz might get overlooked in light of the likes of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, but he's not a newcomer to Israeli politics at all. For decades, he's been a fixture of Likud governments, serving as transportation minister or foreign minister and finance minister. His reputation was that of a reliable party loyalist, more a bureaucratic operator than an ideologue. Unlike firebrand figures like Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, who emerged from the settler movement and openly espoused racist and eliminationist ideas, Katz was regarded as a technocrat who lacked their populist flair. One of those dull, safe pair of hands types in the background. Well, this image shifted dramatically when he assumed the defence portfolio in November of last year. The timing was significant. His predecessor, Yoav Gallant, had overseen the most destructive phases of the Gaza campaign up until then, policies of siege and starvation that left him facing an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Gallant had cloaked his decisions in the language of security, of dismantling Hamas's military capacity and creating buffer zones and protecting Israel from rockets. But the reality was mass civilian death, even of Israelis, as since departing of his role, he's confirmed the use of Hannibal directives on that night of October 7th, 2023. But the rhetoric retained that familiar frame of military necessity. Katz broke that habit. His plague of the firstborn remark cannot be dismissed as an unfortunate turn of phrase. It was a deliberate invocation of sacred violence. In biblical terms, the plague was not a military engagement. It was the indiscriminate death of children as a form of collective punishment. By invoking it, Katz crossed a rhetorical threshold, therefore. He aligned Israeli strategy not with the language of necessity, but the imagery of annihilation. That he did so as defense minister, a post with direct authority over the Israeli defense forces, made the comment even more dangerous. This was not the rhetoric of an opposition provocateur, nor the ranting of an extremist on the political fringes. It was the voice of the state itself here. The significance of Katz's words become clearer when compared to the likes of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Those two are often cast by international observers as the symbols of Israeli extremism, their eliminationist language serving as the cautionary tale of how far-right settlers gained influence over policy. Katz, however, has revealed that the same extremist logic resides in the heart of Likud as well, which is supposed to be a much more mainstream party, if such a notion even really truly exists in Israel, which I very much don't believe it does. But if Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say the quiet part out loud, and Katz has begun to do the same thing, but with the full weight of government authority, exposing all the more that extremism is actually more mainstream in Israel. And just because some say the quiet part out loud, doesn't mean many of the others aren't thinking exactly the same thing. The continuity between Gaza and Yemen is all part of the same template for Israel as well. In Gaza, Israel systematically redefined civilian infrastructure as Hamas infrastructure, didn't they? A hospital became a command centre, a school was a weapons depot, a refugee camp a launch site. Well, this narrative gave cover for strikes that destroyed much of Gaza's civilian life and killed tens of thousands. Independent organisations from the United Nations to Médecins Sans Frontières have catalogued the devastating impact, but Israel has maintained its line that every target was militarily justified. In Yemen, the same pattern is unfolding. On the 24th of August, Israeli jets struck Sanaa's presidential palace, a fuel depot, and the Houthis power station. Katz celebrated the destruction of the palace as a blow against a Houthi command compound. Yet health authorities in Yemen reported civilian deaths, hospital outages, and widespread blackouts that affected water pumping stations and clinics. A lot of familiar echoes in this, isn't there? In earlier strikes, residential neighbourhoods in Sanaa were hit with as many as 40 missiles, flattening civilian homes. Again, rather familiar. The Houthis power station was likewise bombed on the claim it had been militarised, despite being a critical facility for civilians. And this is precisely the Gaza playbook transposed to a new theatre. If every institution in Gaza can be labelled Hamas, then every structure in Yemen can just as easily be labelled Houthi. And the result is the same: hospitals without power, families without homes, and civilians left dead or maimed. What distinguishes Yemen is that the justification is even thinner. Whereas Israel can at least point to Hamas governing Gaza, the Houthis are the de facto government of northern Yemen. Declaring their presidential palace or their power stations to be illegitimate military assets is tantamount to declaring that the entire functioning of civilian life under their control is a target. But far from being deterred and far more capable of retaliation than Hamas arguably are, the Houthis have very much doubled down on their campaign against Israel by extension, because let's face it, when do they ever back down from anything? It simply isn't in their DNA. Since the escalation of the Gaza war in late 2023, they have explicitly framed their missile and drone operations against Israel as solidarity actions for the Palestinian people. Their leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi has repeatedly described Israeli policy as a genocidal war of starvation against Gaza, insisting that Yemen has a duty to respond militarily. And where so many Arab nations talk the talk but do not back it up with action, the Houthis, of course, very much have been doing that. Much of this year, they've been repeatedly targeting Ben Gurion Airport, of course, injuring several people and disrupting flights. In July, they claimed responsibility for drone and missile attacks on Jaffa, Tel Aviv, Ashkelon, and the Negev. So the pattern is a very clear one. Israel's strikes on Yemen have not stopped Houthi attacks at all. They provoked more of them. Each declaration from Katz that Israel will respond with compound interest has been followed by fresh launches. For the Houthis, the framing as defenders of Palestine enhances their legitimacy domestically and regionally. In a country scarred by years of Saudi and Emirati bombing, presenting themselves as part of the Palestinian struggle elevates their status from insurgents to vanguard resistors of Zionism. In Arab public opinion more broadly, this narrative has traction. The Gaza war is seen not as an isolated conflict, but as part of a larger confrontation between Israel and the peoples of the region. Israel has not confined itself to reactive airstrikes, though. Reports indicate that it has begun building a detailed target bank for Yemen, cataloguing missile launch platforms, drone facilities, logistic hubs, and Red Sea ports said to be used for smuggling. And this effort reflects a shift from short-term retaliation to preparation for a sustained campaign, then. Building such a target bank requires intelligence gathering and prioritization, things they found rather hard to do in Yemen previously. But it signals Israel's intent to prosecute a war against the Houthis with a long-term horizon in mind. Alongside the target bank, Israel and the United States have apparently embarked on a cyber espionage campaign designed to try and infiltrate Yemeni networks and civil society. They're still desperate to try and get intelligence on the Houthis somehow. According to investigative reporting, operatives have masqueraded as employers or academics, sending false job offers or invitations to activists and journalists in Yemen. The goal is to gather that intelligence, recruit informants, and destabilize the Houthi information environment. This digital war supplements the kinetic one. Yet these strategies confront the same obstacles that defeated the Saudi-led coalition and the US-UK campaign. The Houthis are decentralized, resilient, and deeply embedded in the communities they govern. Their storage facilities, their launch sites, their command structures have survived years of bombardment precisely because they are dispersed and they are mobile. No amount of target banking or cyber infiltration is likely to overcome that kind of resilience. Indeed, the attempts may further entrench the Houthis' claim that they are resisting not just Saudi Arabia or Israel, but the combined might of Western imperial powers within the Middle East. Why then would Katz escalate in this way when it only actually plays into the Houthis' own narrative? Well, the answer lies partly in domestic politics. Within Israel's fractious coalition, Katz must prove himself as a strongman defense minister now. By speaking in biblical language of extermination, he outflanks his rivals like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, appealing to the far-right base of Likud and reassuring Netanyahu's supporters that he is uncompromising. A second motive is psychological warfare. Katz appears to believe that invoking apocalyptic imagery can intimidate his adversaries. The plague of the firstborn was not simply a colourful phrase, it was intended to terrify, to suggest that no level of retaliation is off the table, that Israel will very much go there. And of course, we know they would, because they've done it already in Gaza. Whether this intimidates the Houthis, however, is rather doubtful, isn't it? But it signals to his domestic audience, it plays to them well, that he's prepared to escalate without restraint. The third motive is international. By pushing rhetoric to extremes, Katz tests the tolerance of Israel's allies. Thus far, the United States and the EU have continued to provide military and diplomatic cover. If the defense minister can speak of slaughtering children without provoking censure from them, then Israel can very much conclude that Western backing is secure no matter how outrageous its conduct becomes. Silence will once again become complicity, therefore. Katz's words are therefore also a test for them, probing whether Israel's impunity actually does have any limits. The problem for Katz is that the strategy is still failing. If the Saudi-led coalition could not defeat the Houthis between 2015 and 2023, despite years of bombing and blockade, and if the US and UK could not silence them during their campaign in 2023 to earlier this year, Israel will not succeed on their own at all. How can they possibly? Geography also compounds the problem. Yemen is distant from them, its terrain is mountainous, and its society is extremely resilient. Strikes from the air cannot eliminate the movement's ability to launch missiles and drones. The blowback's severe. Red Sea shipping is already imperiled and remains so, with insurance costs rising and international carriers all rerouting. The Houthis' identification with Palestine strengthens their regional legitimacy. Each Israeli strike deepens Israeli diplomatic isolation. Western publics, already uneasy with Gaza, now witness Israel expanding its war to one of the world's poorest and most famine-stricken countries. As if they haven't done enough damage to Gaza, they want to pick on another famine-stricken country. So the optics of that are scandalous as well. The perception of Israel as a rogue state willing to export collective punishment across borders grows ever sharper. The extension of Israeli strikes into Yemen carries devastating humanitarian consequences, therefore. Yemen was already devastated by years of Saudi-led war that produced one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Malnutrition, famine and cholera had only begun to ease after a fragile truce. By bombing power stations and fuel depots and civilian neighbourhoods, Israel risked tipping the country back into humanitarian freefall. And this, of course, mirrors Gaza perfectly, where deliberate restrictions on food, medicine and fuel have produced a starvation crisis recognised by the International Court of Justice as evidence of genocidal intent. The export of these tactics to Yemen raises the spectre of another famine then, this time in a country already on the brink. Children once again are at the centre of the suffering. So Katz's plague of the firstborn comment is not only rhetorical, it actually resonates with the reality of policies that deprive children of electricity for hospitals, fuel for water pumps and food for survival. A further dimension is the religious symbolism embedded in Katz's rhetoric as well. By invoking biblical imagery, he frames Israel's war not merely as a political struggle, but as part of a sacred mission. And they do love that kind of viewpoint, don't they? This sacralization of violence makes compromise harder. If the war is cast in terms of divine plagues and extermination, then ceasefires and negotiations become seen as betrayals of that, betrayals of destiny. This language also blurs the line between state policy and religious zealotry, of course. Where Gallant spoke the language of military necessity, Katz speaks the language of sacred annihilation now. And that rhetorical shift has profound consequences in and of itself. It embeds the conflict in narratives that reach far beyond rational strategy, pushing Israel's actions into the realm of apocalyptic confrontation. Israel Katz's plague of the firstborn remark encapsulates the trajectory of Israel's war doctrine. What was once denied, the deliberate targeting of civilians, is now suggested openly. What was once dressed up in the language of security necessity is now draped in the imagery of extermination. Katz represents the mainstreaming of extremism within Israel's state apparatus, revealing that the logic of collective punishment has become not only policy, but ideology too. Israel's airstrikes on Sanaa, its bombing of power stations, and Katz's biblical threats have, of course, not silenced the Houthis. On the contrary, they have prompted new declarations and retaliatory strikes because it's what they do. They don't back down. The Yemeni armed forces released statements within hours of those August bombardments, vowing that Israeli crimes in Sanaa will not go unanswered, and linking their operations directly to what they call Israel's genocidal war of starvation in Gaza. And their leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, has framed the escalation not simply as a bilateral conflict with Israel, but as part of the Houthis' wider duty to stand with the Palestinian people. The Houthis' rhetoric was quickly matched with action as well, because it always is. Just this week, they launched further missile salvos towards Israel, claiming responsibility for targeting military and strategic sites across the occupied territories. They emphasized that these attacks were direct retaliation for Israeli strikes on Yemen, portraying their actions as defensive solidarity rather than unprovoked aggression. In their communications, they also highlighted the use of US-made bombs in Israeli strikes on Yemeni civilians, insisting that the war exposed the complicity of Washington and London alongside Tel Aviv, even as these forces are no longer directly attacking them themselves. So in practice, this cycle of attack and counterattack has bolstered the Houthis' standing both at home and in the wider region. Domestically presenting themselves as the vanguard of the Palestinian struggle resonates powerfully in a country traumatized by a decade of Saudi and Emirati bombardment, and they very much maintain the support of the Yemeni people. Each missile fired at Ben Gurion or Tel Aviv is framed as evidence that they are striking directly at the heart of the state they accuse of genocide. For Israel, this represents the collapse of deterrence, though. Katz's promise to punish Yemen with biblical plagues was supposed to scare the Houthis into retreat. Instead, it has galvanized their defiance and provided them with an expanded narrative that Israel's genocidal tactics in Gaza are now being attempted to be replicated in Yemen, and that Yemen's resistance is therefore all now part of the same existential struggle. The result is that Israel's bombing has not neutralized the Houthis, but inflamed their determination and detonated new fronts of resistance. The export of the Gaza playbook to Yemen demonstrates that Israel is willing to reproduce its most devastating tactics on all new fronts. Civilian infrastructure is redefined as enemy infrastructure, and the deaths of women and children are brushed aside as the enemy's fault. The Houthis, far from being defeated, respond with greater intensity, positioning themselves as defenders of Palestine and entrenching regional resistance. Strategically, Israel is overreaching. If the combined might of Saudi Arabia, the United States and the United Kingdom could not silence the Houthis, Israel will not succeed alone, and especially when it is still making so much war on so many other fronts, from Gaza to the West Bank to Lebanon to Syria. Humanitarian catastrophe looms, diplomatic isolation deepens, and the image of Israel as a rogue state hardens. Katz may believe that his rhetoric projects strength. In reality, it exposes his weakness. The inability to defeat adversaries except by threatening extermination, the reliance on biblical plagues of all things to disguise strategic failure, and the resort to collective punishment in place of genuine security. His words will be remembered not as intimidation, but as the moment when Israel's extremism really got laid bare, and when its war on Gaza spilled fully into a regional conflagration that threatens to consume more than Israel can control. And controlling the Houthis? Well, that was always going to be a long shot. Of course, if such militant and biblical rhetoric doesn't cut through, there's always the propaganda Israel pump out, isn't there? A Hasbara that the world's media dutifully reports on, right? Nah, not so much. Not cutting through anymore, is it? Perhaps that's why Katz is so openly offensive these days, but that isn't to say Israel aren't still terrified by the prospect of people no longer pitying them as victims, and so desperate are they to win back their victim status that they bust in a load of so-called influencers to try and debunk the claims of death at aid distribution sites and the like, but that's backfired horribly on them too, as this video recommendation here, as your suggested next watch, will tell you all about. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.